No sooner did the imposing interests of white Seattleites mean exclusion and exile for Native and Chinese Americans than did another group seek exile in the city in the late 19th century. The Seattle PI was perplexed by the possibility of a Negro exodus to Seattle.
A good deal has been said and written of late about the Negro exodus, the sudden movement of Negroes from the South to the North and West. Their coming north would be a mistake. There is room for only a limited number of colored people here. The few Negroes that are here now do vastly better than they would if their numbers were increased. Seattle Post-Intelligencer, May 28th, 1879.
You referred to other people who were here, the native people and the Chinese, and that article made mention of it as well, that 1879 article from the Intelligencer. I think that people of African descent were probably better treated than native people and Chinese people, and I base it mostly on the fact that they were a much smaller number of people. They simply were not as visible. They were not as threatening, I suppose.
The story of Black Seattle in the year spanning 1865 to 1968 was that of gradually increasing numbers and an accompanying crescendo of racial tensions in the city's politics. Too small to show up on the racial radar of potentially hostile white Seattleites, much of the black community of the late 19th and early 20th centuries has been described as middle class by any standard. The definitive book on early black Seattle spoke heavily of the black Victorians.
There was a small group here, usually people who were in business, or women whose husbands were in business, for instance, and they were able to, they had the leisure time to go to matinees and meet in each other's homes for teas and probably cards.
A classic text in African American sociology once wrote critically of a black bourgeoisie, and families like the Catons, the Gatons, and the Grahams lived on East Madison and enjoyed a level of separation from the racy strip along Pioneer Square.
It was class, because a lot of the people who were living along Yesler and whatnot probably had more money than some of the East Madison residents, but it was a question of how they made their money.
Unlike most Negroes, we lived in a tradition of success, achievement, and hope for Negro liberation. There were parts of the city where we were not even allowed to drive through. Those people were morally corrupt and a great discredit to the race. Horace Caton, Jr.
The isolation enjoyed by the Victorians in the 19th century would wane. The 20th century saw blacks leaving the South in staggering numbers, and the forging of a new kind of black community in Seattle.
In the 20th century, of course, Seattleites founded one of the first NAACP chapters on the West Coast here in 1913. And later in the 1920s, there would be at least two chapters of the UNIA, or the Universal Negro Improvement Association. By 1930, that would be the Urban League. To be perfectly honest, I don't think there's a major civil rights organization that was active, let's say, before World War II that didn't have some presence in Seattle.
Years later, Black Victorian, playwright, and Seattleite Shirley Graham would wed W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP and vigorous critic of the racial hierarchy in America's major cities. Their matrimony may as well have symbolized Black Seattle's marriage with the larger politics of the 10s, 20s, and 30s.
Being connected to or being part of organizations like the UNIA or the NAACP or supporting the Urban League makes local people part of what I call the national, and in the case of the UNIA, the international struggle for racial justice. In other words, black people in Seattle joined the UNIA knowing full well that they're going to be part of a movement that extends all around the world.
International connectedness was particularly important in Seattle, with blacks of the 20s and 30s sharing space with Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino Americans. This mode of spatially concentrated diversity was largely unseen in cities like New York and Chicago, and the mosaic of peoples of color called attention to the different worldviews among peoples of color.
The other thing about the Japanese Americans especially is that they realized early on that it was very important to concentrate in economics and economic development and entrepreneurship in ways or patterns that were not followed by African Americans or by another Asian group, Filipinos. So you're dealing with a very, very special population in Seattle that sees its place, its position in the society differently, let's say, from African Americans.
The cross-section between blacks and Japanese Americans in Seattle during the 20s and 30s is illuminating. While African Americans generally established politically contentious organizations, Japanese Americans tended to choose a path of less resistance and opted instead for economic mobilization. In 1931, community icon James Sakamoto wrote that racial agitation only begets agitation. Declaring a kind of creed for Japanese Americans in the 20s and 30s, Sakamoto continued, "We believe that complaints against race prejudice are not justified. Complaints only show that something is lacking in the initiative and ability of the one who complains." By World War II, Seattle's Japanese community was interned, while a massive migration from the South quadrupled black Seattle, from 3,700 in 1940 to 15,000 in 1950.
The NAACP grew from about 75 members in 1940 to about 1,500 members in 1945. And so that's an example of both an increase in the population, but also a concomitant increase in awareness of race, of the issues of race, the problems of race, and the fact that the community has to deal with.
I think then you're talking about a combination of people from the South and institutions that have already been set up in the black community here in Seattle, and the two come together in a way that is very potent and helps move forward the struggles for civil rights.
Seattle shared organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League with other northern cities, but it also shared the problem of segregation with the South. Concentrated within an inner-city area that became known as the Central District, blacks were usually unable to rent or buy in other, whiter parts of the city. The de facto segregation endured by blacks through the 1950s became the subject of civic legislation by the early 1960s. Local churches and clubs coalesced with national organizations like the NAACP in support of an open housing ordinance. Seattle voters said no to integration and yes to segregation by rejecting the ordinance. After the landslide failure of 1964, it was clear that Seattle had more in common with Birmingham than people thought. The black populations of both cities had to look outside of conventional civic politics for solutions to the problem of the color line.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. visited the University of Washington campus in fall of 1963 to support the soon-to-be-failed open housing campaign. The student newspaper, The Daily, would seize the occasion and devote an entire issue to the civil rights struggles going on around the city. By the ominous month of May 1968, the sons and daughters of the World War II migration found a voice and lifted it to denounce the university's under-enrollment and neglect of black, brown, and poor white students. The newly formed Black Student Union protested university policy, and when negotiations proved ineffective, the student group scaled the administration building, occupied the office of President Charles Odegaard, and successfully demanded a change. By the late 60s, the black population of Seattle was basically still segregated, and a host of agitated organs addressed the political, social, and economic needs of black Seattle. Unimpressed by the accommodationist tactics of the NAACP, groups such as the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers spoke directly to Seattle's black underclass. The city had come a long way since the calm days of the Black Victorians, when the class standings of blacks in the 19th century was basically bourgeois. The slight increase of the World War I era led to the first self-consciously black organizations in Seattle, and the massive increase of the World War II years anticipated the transformative politics of the turbulent 1960s.
They may have some problems in those sort of uncivilized places, but here in Seattle, where, we're all about niceness, we don't have, we've managed to resolve our racial problems by just talking about them or what have you, when in fact, a lot of times they've managed to resolve their racial problems because for a long time they didn't have the populations that would make it a problem, or they've managed to organize things spatially in such a way that the problems sort of fell in upon themselves.